They told me the cabin was too remote for someone my age, that the stairs down to the dock would ruin my hip, that the loons would keep me up at night. You'd be miserable up there, Mom. Just stay in Calgary and look after the dog. That's what my son said over Sunday dinner, cutting his roast beef like he was cutting me out of something bigger than a family trip. My daughter-in-law nodded along, already scrolling through her phone, probably booking the rental on my old Muskoka Lake without once thinking the property still had my husband's name carved into the boathouse beam. I didn't argue. I said I'd watch Biscuit. I said the cabin was probably too much for me anyway. I said all the small, agreeable things I'd been saying for the last 12 years since George died, the things that made me easy to be around and even easier to forget. But the next morning, when I went out to get the paper, I found something tucked into my mailbox behind the flyers from Safeway and a Canadian Tire catalog, a travel folder. The kind places still print out when you book in person. Inside were 4 confirmation numbers for the Muskoka cabin, dates circled in red pen, and at the bottom, a handwritten note from my son's travel agent that read, "Hi Margaret, your son asked me to drop off the reservation paperwork since the cabin is under your name. The deposit ran on your credit card on file. Let me know if you'd like me to send the final receipt to your email. Thanks, Julie." I stood on the porch in my slippers and my old blue housecoat and read that piece of paper 3 times. The deposit ran on your credit card. The cabin is under your name. My son had used my card, the one I kept for family emergencies, because he'd begged me to keep it active after he lost his job in 2019. He'd used it to book a family vacation at the property I owned and hadn't been to in 4 summers because nobody ever invited me. I walked back inside. Biscuit wagged his tail at my feet, and I bent down to scratch his ears with hands that had started to shake. I put the kettle on. I sat at the kitchen table where George and I used to do the crossword together, and I watched the steam rise out of the spout like it was the only thing in the world that still had somewhere to go. The clock on the stove said 7:14. My son's flight from Calgary to Toronto, with a connection up to the cabin, wasn't for 9 more days. I picked up the phone and called Julie. She answered on the 3rd ring. Cheerful, the way those travel agents always are. I told her I was Margaret Whitfield, and I needed her to cancel the reservation and refund the deposit to my visa. She hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure? Your son was very specific. He said I told her I was the one whose name was on the title, and I was the one whose credit card had been charged, and I was the one calling." She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Of course, Mrs. Whitfield. I'll process that right now." I gave her my confirmation number. I thanked her. I hung up. Then I sat back down at the table and cried for exactly 4 minutes, which was longer than I'd cried at George's funeral, because at the funeral I'd been too busy making sure everyone else had coffee. When I was done, I wiped my face with a tea towel and opened my laptop. I typed in the name of a little bed and breakfast I'd been reading about for years, a place on the east coast of Newfoundland called Trinity. It had been in one of those Canadian Geographic spreads George used to leave open on my nightstand, hinting. We'd always said we'd go someday. Someday had gotten away from us. I booked myself a room for 10 nights. I booked a flight out of Calgary to Street. John's with a connection in Toronto, economy, aisle seat, leaving in 3 days. The whole thing came to just under $3,000. I'd been adding to my TFSA every month since George passed, and I hadn't touched it once. Not for the new furnace. Not for my grandson's orthodontics when my son asked. I'd saved it the way my mother saved tea bags, quietly, without explanation, like it might mean something someday. It meant something now. I called my neighbor Donna, who's 71 and still runs marathons, and asked if she'd take Biscuit for 2 weeks. She said she'd been waiting years for me to finally do something reckless, and that Biscuit was welcome for as long as I needed. I didn't tell her where I was going. I just said I needed the time. I packed 1 suitcase. My winter coat, because it was early October and Newfoundland would be cold. My good walking shoes. The green cardigan George had bought me in Banff the year before he died. A paperback I'd been meaning to read since 2018. My passport, even though I wouldn't need it, because carrying it made me feel like I was going somewhere that mattered. And the small silver locket my mother had left me, the one I'd stopped wearing after my daughter-in-law told me it looked old-fashioned. The night before the flight, I sat on my back step and watched the sun go down behind the Rockies. The air smelled like dry grass and the first wood smoke of fall. I thought about the last time my son had called me just to talk, not to ask for something, not to tell me he'd be late picking up the kids, just to talk. I couldn't remember. I thought about how my granddaughter Claire, who was 14, still sent me memes on Facebook Messenger and waited patiently while I figured out how to react to them. I thought about all the years I'd driven across 2 provinces, to babysit, to help with moves, to sit in hospital waiting rooms during my grandson's tonsil surgery. I thought about the bridal shower I'd hosted in my living room for my daughter-in-law, the way she'd thanked everyone else by name, and just called me Ian's mom in the toast. I was going to Newfoundland. I was going to the ocean. I was going as far east as I could go without leaving the country. The flight was long and I didn't sleep. The woman beside me was a nurse from Lethbridge going home to visit her sister in Corner Brook. She asked me if I was visiting family too. I said no, I was visiting myself. She laughed. Then she looked at me more carefully and said, "Good for you." She didn't ask anything else, and I was grateful. Street Johns in October smelled like salt and coal smoke and something else underneath. Something older, like wet rope and cold stone. The taxi driver who took me out to Trinity was a man in his 60s named Jerry, who talked the whole 2.5 hours about cod moratoriums and his granddaughter in Halifax and the price of heating oil. I didn't say much. I just watched the scenery change, from city to barrens, to those rolling coastal hills covered in tuckamore, bent sideways from a century of wind. When we came over the last rise and I saw Trinity below us, all those white and red houses stitched along the harbor, I pressed my hand to the window without meaning to. The bed and breakfast was run by a woman named Edith, probably around my age, with hands like baking paper and a voice that made you feel like you'd known her for 30 years within 5 minutes. She showed me to my room, which had a narrow bed, a rag rug, and a window that looked straight out over the harbor. When she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and didn't move for almost an hour. I just listened. The gulls. A foghorn somewhere, way out. The old wooden house creaking around me like a ship. That evening, I walked down to the water. The wind was so cold it made my eyes water, but I kept walking, past the fishing stages painted oxblood red, past a man mending nets outside his shed. I ended up at a little pub called the Rocket. I ordered fish and chips and a glass of house white, and I ate it at a table by the window while a fiddler in the corner played songs I'd never heard, but somehow recognized. That was where I met Frances. She was sitting 2 tables over, alone, reading a well-worn copy of Alistair MacLeod and nursing a pint of Quiddy Vidi. She looked up when I came in, gave me a small nod, and went back to her book. She was maybe a few years younger than me, late 60s, with short gray hair cut almost like a boy's and a Navy fisherman's sweater that looked like she'd owned it for 30 years. When the fiddler finished his set, she clapped and called out, "Beautiful, Dennis," and he grinned at her like she was family. I figured she was local. She wasn't. I found out the next morning at Edith's breakfast table. She'd come up from Ottawa, retired, a former librarian, recently widowed. Edith had put us in rooms across the hall from each other, and somehow by the time I'd finished my second piece of partridgeberry toast, Frances and I had made a plan to walk the Skirwink Trail together. The trail was harder than I expected. My knees complained going up the first rise, and my lungs reminded me that I'd quit smoking 41 years ago, but not early enough. Frances didn't rush me. She stopped when I stopped. She pointed at a bald eagle drying its wings on a spruce snag and said, "Would you look at that?" as though we'd paid for the view. When we got to the lookout, where the cliffs dropped straight down into that green-black water, she sat on a rock and I sat on another, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she said, "My husband died in March. I've been trying to figure out how to be a person again." I looked at her, and I said, "My husband died 12 years ago, and I'm only just starting." That night we had dinner together at the Rocket again. She asked me how I'd ended up in Trinity, and I told her. The cabin, the credit card, the words my son had said over his roast beef. I told her about Julie, the travel agent, and the silver locket, and the fact that my daughter-in-law hadn't texted me once in the 3 days I'd been gone. Frances listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took a sip of her wine, set it down carefully, and said, "Margaret, you didn't run away. You came home." I didn't know what she meant, exactly, but I felt it in my chest anyway. On my 4th night in Trinity, my phone lit up for the first time since I'd landed. 17 missed calls, 12 texts, 3 voicemails. I'd had it on silent in my purse, charged but ignored. I sat on the edge of my bed and scrolled through. Most were from my son. A few from my daughter-in-law. One from my daughter Rachel, who lived in Vancouver and only called on birthdays. The texts started casual, got confused, then got angry. "Mom, did you cancel the cabin? Mom, the rental company says the reservation is void. What's going on? Mom, pick up. We need to talk. This isn't funny." The voicemails I didn't listen to. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep. In the morning, I told Frances. She laughed, then stopped and said, "Are you going to respond?" I said I didn't know yet. She nodded. "Don't feel you have to. Silence is an answer, too." That afternoon, we drove out to Elliston to see the puffins. The season was almost over, and most of them had left, but a few were still there, standing on their little ledges with their clown faces turned into the wind. I stood on the bluff and thought about all the years I'd been standing on various ledges, waiting for someone to notice I was up there. When we got back to Edith's that evening, there was a message. My son had somehow got the number of the bed and breakfast. He'd called twice. Edith handed me the pink slip with the phone number on it and said, "I told him you were out." I didn't tell him where. I thanked her. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat in the parlor with Frances, and we played cribbage like 2 old widows in a Lucy Maud Montgomery novel, and I laughed harder than I had in years when she skunked me 2 hands in a row. That night, I took out the stationery Edith had left on the desk and wrote a letter. Not to my son. To Claire, my granddaughter. I told her where I was. I told her about the puffins, and the fiddler at the pub, and the woman I'd met named Frances. I told her that I was doing something her grandfather and I had talked about doing for years and never done. I told her that I loved her, and that she didn't need to worry, and that if her parents asked, she could tell them I was fine, but she didn't have to if she didn't want to. I put a stamp on it and mailed it the next morning from the post office on the hill, where the postmistress recognized me from the pub and said, "Going home already?" And I said, "No, just sending some words ahead." Claire wrote back 4 days later, a real letter, on loose-leaf paper torn out of a binder. It said, "Gran, Dad, and Mom are losing their minds. Dad keeps saying you're having some kind of breakdown. Mom won't stop talking about the credit card. Nobody asked me what I think, but I think you're doing the coolest thing anyone in our family has ever done. Please send me a postcard with a puffin on it. Love, Claire." At the bottom, in smaller writing, "I don't think you're broken." I cried in Edith's front hall holding that letter, and Edith, God bless her, just handed me a cup of tea and left me alone. Frances and I stayed on. My original booking was for 10 nights. I extended it twice. We took the ferry across to Fogo Island one Wednesday and stood on the edge of the world in the hard wind. We drove out to Bonavista and put our hands on the statue of John Cabot. We ate croutons with molasses for breakfast most mornings, and Frances taught me how to knit a proper Gansey stitch in the evenings, while the radio played from the kitchen. I didn't turn my phone back on, not really. I checked it once a day for texts from Claire. Everything else I let drift. My son kept calling. My daughter-in-law sent one long text that I read standing at the window one morning, the sun coming in low and gold across the harbor. It said she was sorry for what Ian had said. She didn't realize the cabin was still in my name. She didn't realize the card had been mine. There had been a mix-up, and could we please talk? I read it twice. Then I put the phone down and went downstairs for breakfast. The mix-up, I thought, as if the words my son had said at dinner had been a mix-up, as if the dozen years of small dismissals had been a mix-up, as if I had been a mix-up. On my 16th day in Trinity, Rachel called. I answered because it was Rachel, and she almost never called. Her voice was careful. She said, "Mom, are you okay? Ian is telling everyone you've lost it." I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked out at the harbor. I said, "Rachel, I'm in Newfoundland. I've never been better." There was a pause. Then she said, "Newfoundland? What are you doing in Newfoundland?" I said, "Living." She was quiet for a long time. Then, very softly, she said, "I should have called you more, Mom. I'm sorry." I told her I wasn't keeping score. She said, "You should be." That was the closest thing to a real conversation I'd had with my daughter in 10 years. I stayed on the phone for an hour. She told me about her job, which I hadn't asked about in years because she'd stopped telling me things. She told me her partner had moved out in July, and she hadn't told anyone in the family yet. She told me she'd been in therapy since February. I listened. When we hung up, I sat there holding the phone like it was a small, warm animal, and I thought, I missed so much by not asking. Frances was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She took one look at me and poured me a glass of sherry at 4 in the afternoon. We sat at Edith's kitchen table, and I told her about Rachel. Frances said, "Sometimes you have to go very far away before people can see you clearly, and sometimes so can you." I don't think I've ever heard a truer sentence. On my 21st day, I booked a flight home. Not because I was ready exactly, but because I could feel the trip had finished its work with me. Frances was staying another week. We hugged at Edith's front door, and she pressed a piece of paper into my hand with her address on it in Ottawa and said, "When you come east again, and you will, there's a spare room with your name on it." I hugged her again. The flight back was easier. I slept most of it. When I landed in Calgary, the first snow of the year was coming down in big, lazy flakes that reminded me of the first time George and I had driven the mountains together, 52 years ago in a Pontiac with no heat. Donna picked me up at the airport with Biscuit in the back seat. Biscuit lost his mind. Donna took one look at me and said, "Something's changed." I didn't answer. I just smiled. Ian was waiting in my driveway when Donna dropped me off. He was leaning against his SUV in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, breath coming out white. He looked older than I remembered. He looked tired. When I got out, he came forward fast, and for a second, I thought he was going to hug me. He didn't. He stopped a few feet away and said, "Mom, we need to talk." I told him to come inside. I put the kettle on. I took my coat off slowly. He stood in the kitchen like a man in a stranger's house, which, in a way, he was, because I was a stranger to him now, and he to me. He said, "What were you thinking?" I poured the tea. I sat down. I said I was thinking I'd been treated like the help for 12 years, and I was done. He flinched. He said, "Mom, that's not fair. We love you." I said, "Ian, you used my credit card to book a vacation at a cabin I own, on property your father built, and you didn't invite me. You told me at dinner I was too old to come. Then you told me to watch the dog." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. He looked at the tea. He didn't drink it. After a long time, he said, "I didn't know how to ask you." I said, "You didn't ask me anything. You told me." He nodded slowly. He said, "Lindsay is really upset." I said, "I imagine she is." He said, "The kids kept asking where you were. Claire was weird about it. She said we should figure it out ourselves. That almost made me laugh." He said, "Are you coming to Christmas?" I said, "I don't know yet." He looked up, startled. I said, "Ian, I love you. I love your children. I'm not going to disappear. But I'm also not going to come over and make the stuffing and wash the roasting pan and drive home at 10 o'clock at night by myself the way I've done every December since your father died. If you want me there, you invite me. You set a place. You ask what I'd like to bring. You don't tell me what to do, and you don't forget I'm in the room." His eyes filled up. I watched it happen. I didn't reach for him. He said, "Okay, Mom." I said, "We'll see." He left around 8. I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear up the street. Then I let Biscuit out into the yard and stood on the back step and breathed in the cold, dry Calgary air. And I thought, I am still here. I am 68 years old and I am still here. The next morning there was a card in my mailbox. Handwritten. From Lindsay, my daughter-in-law. She'd written 3 pages. She said a lot of things I'd waited a long time to hear, and some I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. She said she'd grown up with a grandmother who kept her distance, and she didn't know how to love a mother-in-law, and she'd been cowardly about trying to learn. She said she was sorry. She asked if I'd have coffee with her, just the 2 of us, sometime soon. At the bottom, she'd written, "No kids, no Ian, just us. Whenever you're ready, no pressure." I set the card on the mantel next to the photograph of George at the cabin, the one where he's holding up a lake trout and grinning like a boy. I didn't respond to Lindsay right away. I let a week go by. Then I called her, and I said, "Yes, coffee, Thursday at 11, at the little place on 4th Avenue she likes, not the chain." She sounded relieved. She sounded like she'd been holding her breath for a week. We sat for 2 hours. I listened more than I talked. She cried twice. I didn't cry at all, which surprised me. Somewhere in that conversation something started to shift, not fixed, not forgiven in the way people mean when they say forgiven, but turned, like a key halfway in a lock. Claire came over that Saturday. Just her. She rode her bike across the city because she said she wanted to. She brought me a puffin magnet she'd bought online with her own money because I still hadn't sent the postcard. I made her hot chocolate. We sat on my couch with Biscuit between us, and she asked me about Newfoundland. Really asked, the way a person asks when they want the real answer. I told her everything, the trail, the fiddler, Francis, the letter from her, the puffins. I even told her about the voicemails I never listened to. She said, "Gran, can I show you something?" She pulled out her phone. She showed me a notes app on it, full of quotes. At the top it said, "Things my grandmother taught me on accident." Under it, "You can leave without slamming the door. Silence is an answer. Don't ask for a seat at a table that keeps shrinking. Being easy to forget is a choice other people make. You don't have to help them. It's never too late to go east." I looked at her, this girl of 14, and I thought, I don't know when I said any of those things out loud, but I must have, because she heard them. That winter I went to Christmas dinner at Ian's house. Lindsay had made a place card with my name on it in her own handwriting. Not Gran, not Ian's mom, Margaret. She'd asked me 2 weeks in advance what I wanted to bring, and I'd said nothing. And she'd said, "Are you sure?" And I'd said, "Yes, I'm sure." And she'd let me show up empty-handed and welcome, which was something I hadn't known could happen at a family dinner. In February, I flew to Ottawa. Frances met me at the airport in a navy blue coat and a scarf she'd knitted herself. We spent a week walking along the canal in the cold. We went to the National Gallery. We had dinner in the market. We talked about whether we wanted to go to Scotland in the spring. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said yes. The day before I flew home, I sat in Frances's kitchen with a mug of tea and looked out at her bird feeder, where 2 chickadees were fighting over a black oil sunflower seed. I thought about the woman who had stood at her own kitchen window in Calgary 6 months ago and promised her son she'd watch the dog. I thought about all the small words I'd said over the years that had added up to a quiet, accidental disappearance. I thought about my husband, who had known me when I was loud, when I had opinions, when I argued with him about where to live and what to name our children. and whether we should buy the cabin on the lake. He had loved me for that. Somewhere in the years after he died, I had stopped being that woman because no one had asked me to keep being her. I decided, sitting in Francis's kitchen, that I wasn't going to disappear again. Not for my son, not for my daughter-in-law, not for convenience, not for anyone. When I flew home, Claire picked me up from the airport. She'd just turned 15. She'd convinced her dad to let her come alone in the car, even though she only had her learner's permit, and he'd driven her there and was waiting in the cell phone lot. She ran across the arrivals hall and hugged me hard enough that I almost dropped my bag. She said, "Gran, I missed you." I said I was only gone a week. She said, "I know. I still missed you." In the spring, I went to Scotland with Francis. In the summer, I opened up the Muskoka cabin myself, and I didn't invite anyone, and I sat on the dock for hours in the evenings watching the loons, which did not keep me up at night. In the fall, I flew out to Vancouver to see Rachel. She picked me up at the airport. We went for dim sum. She told me she'd started dating someone new, slowly, nothing serious, but he was kind, and that was the main thing. I told her kind is the main thing. She said, "I know, Mom, you taught me that." I didn't remember teaching her that, but I must have, because she heard it. Some evenings now, I sit on my back step in Calgary with Biscuit at my feet and watch the sun go down behind the Rockies. The mountains don't change. I do. I'm 69 now. I still have my hip. I still have my passport. I still have $3,000 tucked away in the TFSA because I replaced what I'd spent on Newfoundland within a year, the way my mother would have. I still have the green cardigan from Banff. I still have the silver locket, which I wear now, every day, because my daughter-in-law never mentions it, and because it wouldn't matter if she did. They told me I was too old for the cabin. They told me to stay home and watch the dog. The next morning I went east, and I kept going.